There are Cold War stories we have heard before and stories we haven't heard. There are those who gain from Cold War and there are those who die from it. First, some old Cold War stories.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Армия обязана быть на высоте по всем вопросам: оснащению, структуре, методам подготовки.
Soviet troops that came to the center of this continent did not leave when peace came. They're still there, uninvited, unwanted, unyielding, almost 40 years after the war.
There are three essential elements in the Western view of the Cold War: missiles, spies, and Soviet suppression in Eastern Europe.
We in the free world rejoiced with them, hoping against hope that Hungary had really succeeded in breaking loose from Soviet domination.
Heavy tanks roll through the streets of Prague as Russian, Polish, and Hungarian troops carry out their cold-blooded occupation of Czechoslovakia.
Despite this Western concern over Soviet suppression of nationalist and independent socialist struggles in East Europe, the West made no military reply. Though East-West competition is very real, Europe has remained militarily stable. But Cold War battles have raged elsewhere. A recent American study by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Institute of World Order found that of 125 military conflicts between 1945 and 1983, 6% were incited by intervention from communist countries, and 79% were incited by intervention from Western countries, but 95% took place in the Third World, the battleground of the Cold War game. Scenes like these had their precedents. The spirit of manifest destiny, a phrase coined to express the United States' obvious right to expand beyond its own borders, had been espoused at the turn of the century by President Teddy Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War. Military intervention to quell local rebellions had often proved necessary to protect U.S. interests. In the words of General Smedley D. Butler of the U.S. Marines, "I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba decent places for the National City Bank to collect revenues in. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916.
Britain are directly responsible for the well-being of all the people of the colonies. There are 60 million of them, men, women and children of every race, color and creed, with 100 different languages, hundreds of different customs and ways of living. To guide and develop this vast empire is no easy matter.
The post-war period saw the end of the British Empire and the old colonial system of European control of Third World resources and government administrations. While the US economy had grown throughout the first half of the century, its foreign involvement had been restricted to Latin America and the Pacific. It took World War II to devastate the old colonial powers and stimulate the US economy, leaving the United States as the world's most powerful nation. New third world markets and resources would be essential to keep the US in that position. US State Department planners recommended consolidating the hold on the Grand Area, a network of countries crucial for US control of the world economy. It included Latin America, Europe, the British Empire, the Middle East oil fields, Japan, and the Pacific Basin. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. Questions of economic disparity were high on the agenda of the newly formed non-aligned movement. Third world nationalists aspire to be free of economic or political domination by East or West. Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, describes the West's reaction. The experiment which we tried in Ghana was essentially one of developing the country in cooperation with the world as a whole. Non-alignment meant exactly what it said. We were not hostile to the socialist bloc the way the governments of the old colonial territories were. It should be remembered that while Britain pursued at home coexistence with the Soviet Union, we were accused of being pro-Russian and introducing the most dangerous ideas into Africa. Dangerous ideas that the Kennedy administration wanted to stop from spreading to the Americas. The underlying effect of Kennedy's development aid to Latin America is described by Noam Chomsky, a leading critic of U.S. foreign policy.
Companies. Peasants in Honduras, for example, are driven off their lands, which are turned over to a range for beef production for export. They are then permitted to cut down the forests and plant crops for themselves for 2 years, after which they're driven off again. The net result is increase in the statistics of development, increase in the gross national product, destruction of the resources, and deterioration of the condition of the people. So hundreds of thousands of people are starving in Honduras, but statistically it looks like an improvement. And that is very typical of the development model that's been pursued. Development's fine as long as it's in our interest, as long as our resources are being developed for our purposes. If a country or any group within a country begins to be concerned with domestic needs, then plainly it has to be stopped. These people must understand that our resources happen to be in their lands, but they're ours.
Washington's reaction was to develop an array of tactics meant to maintain U.S. economic power. Tactics that have been more extreme than we have been led to believe. As the ultimate guarantor of post-war power, atomic and nuclear weapons have played a part in the Cold War game that goes beyond deterring just the Soviets. In Guatemala in 1954, nuclear-equipped bombers supported the CIA coup of the liberal Arbenz government, whose land reforms threatened the United Fruit Company. In the Lebanon crisis of 1958, a secret White House directive was issued preparing nuclear weapons to prevent an Iraqi move into the oil fields of Kuwait. The story of the 1969 threat against Vietnam grew from Washington's fear that third world nationalism could erode America's economic hold over the Pacific, and eventually even Japan. the grand area would be protected under the banner of stopping communism.
Vietnam, formerly French Indochina, under French influence or domination for nearly 200 years. Dien Bien Phu, the French dream of peace with honor ends in inglorious defeat, and the country is divided into two opposing parts, Communist North and non-Communist South Vietnam. The Communists set out to liberate the South, and America, as the champion of the free world, accept the obligation to stop them at any cost.
One post-war pattern was clear. As the weakened colonial powers withdrew, the United States stepped in. The nationalist leader, Ho Chi Minh, and his followers had, in fact, worked with the Americans against Japanese occupation during World War II. He and the Vietnamese had been long-time admirers of the Americans, to the extent that they based their 1945 Declaration of Independence on the US model. But the White House classified the Viet Minh nationalists as tools of international communism.
The concern in the early about Vietnamese independence was that it might have a what the American planners call a rotten apple effect. One rotten apple might infect the barrel, the way Dean Acheson put it in connection with Greece. If there's independence in one region, it may have a demonstration effect and may be picked up elsewhere.
The unofficial war in Vietnam escalated throughout the Eisenhower and Kennedy years. In August 1964, the Johnson administration makes the covert war visible. The United States invaded Vietnam. Washington's recurring post-war tactic to deal with its rotten apples. But the Vietnamese fought a war that defied the devastation of high technology. To the US soldiers, the villages and jungles were full of traps, human and natural. The people and the land confused and terrified them. Meanwhile, back in the US, millions of children were reading the comic book, Tales of the Green Beret.
Champ, I thought I recognized your...
Man, are you a bad penny. Chris, you came down right into the middle of Operation Falling Rain. We're a special forces counter-subversive action. We kidnap, we burn, we execute, we clobber the Kong from the inside, where they live. It's cruel, ruthless, the type of war they invented. But we're giving it back to them, in spades.
In the real Vietnam, children went to school at night to avoid bombing. They drew the war as they lived it. At the same time, the war came home to the US through television. Seeing what a modern high-tech war waged against a third world country actually meant threw much of the United States and the West into moral crisis. A darker side of the American psyche had been exposed. What was happening to the myth of American innocence?
Let me tell you the story of a soldier named Dan. Went out to fight the good fight in South Vietnam. Went out to fight for peace, liberty and all. Went out to fight for equality. Oh, let's go. And the war drags on. They're just there to try and make the people free. But the way that they're doing it don't seem like that to me. Just more bloodletting and misery and tears that this poor country's known for the last 20 years.
What'd you say? What do you think of the demonstration? I think it's lousy. They're nothing but communists, every one of them. They don't deserve to live in this damn country. What do you think about the war? Well, I think about the war, I think it's right. We're fighting for our damn freedom. That's what we're doing. We're fighting for our freedom. And these damn idiots don't realize that. Hell no! He won't go! Hell no! He won't go! Hell no! He won't go! Hell no!
Though few Americans had ever heard of such grandiose terms as the Grand Area, there was growing resentment of what the war meant at home.
Of demonstrating against the war in Vietnam?
I tell you what, I'm not in favor of. I'm not in favor of cleaning up another country when this is filthy.
That's right.
You dig that? What this cracker has to learn is clean home first. Don't worry about Vietnam. You can't guarantee freedom to the people millions of miles away when you got crap going on right here in the neighborhood and in this city.
Right about that.
America needs their own face cleaning first.
If you do become president, would you consider using atomic weapons in Vietnam?
No. I would not consider using atomic weapons in Vietnam, and I'll go further. I take a very firm line on Vietnam, as you probably are aware. But I would not use atomic weapons in Vietnam. I would not invade North Vietnam. And incidentally, I would not invade any of the other countries in the area of Vietnam for a fundamental reason. The goal of the United States in Vietnam must be to end this war in a way that does not produce a bigger war or another war.
July 1969. Despite Nixon's public statements, he secretly sends a threat to the North Vietnamese. He lets it be known that he is ready to escalate the war massively, including the possible use of nuclear weapons, unless some serious breakthrough at the Paris peace talks has been achieved by November the 1st. A few weeks later in Paris, the threat is repeated to the Vietnamese negotiators by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger.
Dr. Henry Kissinger assures Britain's Foreign Secretary that all America wants is peace, with honor and no surrender.
I had to consider how to end the war in Vietnam. One of the options was the nuclear option. Nixon keeps his nerve. By October, with 250,000 demonstrators marching on Washington and still no response from the Vietnamese, Kissinger orders all-out nuclear alert. It lasts a full 29 days, stopping only when the overworked B-52s begin to malfunction. November the 1st. The deadline passes. The Vietnamese do not respond. Nixon does not carry out his threat. He felt the anti-war movement had turned public opinion against such a decision. To Nixon, Vietnam was lost to communism. In fact, Third World nationalists had defeated the greatest power in history. In 10 years of war, the United States dropped in conventional bombs, the equivalent of one Nagasaki bomb a week. Every week, for 7.5 years. Vietnam may have been a limited war for the United States, but it meant total war for the Vietnamese, one that approached the dimensions of nuclear war. Our nuclear nightmares became their daily reality. We in Europe are rightly concerned about the threat of a nuclear holocaust. Television, history books, novels, films, documentaries all describe what could happen to us. And yet, where are the films about the Holocaust the Vietnamese survived? Who can read about Vietnamese heroes and heroines whose human strength overcame the destruction? Some stories seem to get told, while others are ignored. East-West rhetoric hides a growing North-South confrontation in the Cold War game.
My fellow audience, we Americans have lived and prospered under two basic beliefs. 1, belief in the American dream. 2, belief in the Soviet threat. Now, in the 60s, we lost our will to believe in the Soviet threat. So, in the 70s, our belief in the American dream faded away. Well, it's plain common sense. You can't have an American dream without a Soviet threat. So, as a step toward restoring prosperity and gumption, my administration is reintroducing the international communist conspiracy. Supply-side terrorism. It'll make America great again.
In 1981, the calculated resurrection of American mythologies cast a reassuring actor in the role of president.
On the camera, the hair's in place. The same old tales with the same cliches. To rewind, a time machine, stuck in reverse and filming new scenes. 20 years gone with the point of a gun. To hell with reality, faces everyone. To rewind, the late show starring Curly the Raven, Larry and Moe. A rewind. Nostalgia gets stoned, mom and apple pie, no place like home. We get to Viva in the Twilight Zone. Can't you face it, goddammit, yesterday's gone.
The scenario called for President Reagan to revive America's grand area strategy. US power and prestige, so wounded by Vietnam, would finally be healed. Throughout the 1970s, Nixon and Carter developed less visible strategies such as funding what were called authoritarian regimes, who would control their own regions. By 1979, reality was banging on Washington's door. Strong men were falling. Somoza in Nicaragua, the Shah in Iran. US economic power was also being challenged, not only by Europe, but by the growing threat from Japan and even the Third World. Meanwhile, many in the non-aligned movement felt that the hidden agenda of the Cold War game was the maintenance of a North-South economic divide. Third World resentment grew, along with its ever-increasing debt to Western banks. The time for Washington to reassert its authority had come. Its $4,000 billion military budget for the 1980s may be some practical help, but the American public would have to be supported this time around. In a country looking for its pride, the answer lay with Rambo.
For our country to love us as much as we love it.
Armed intervention returned as legitimate foreign policy. Noam Chomsky sees America's new Cold War as an attempt to control the Third World under the pretext of saving the West from communism.
Well, the Cold War has proven to be highly functional for the superpowers. It provides each superpower with a way to control its own population, to bring its own population to support acts of violence and intimidation and intervention in its own domains. And fear of the great enemy is the classic device to achieve this end, and the Cold War has been used very effectively in this manner on both sides.
Most Americans thought they had little to fear from communist expansionism until 1959, when communism crossed oceans and landed in Cuba, despite warnings from a procession of American presidents who said such expansionism must never be tolerated here.
The Soviet Union has established military bases in Ethiopia, Angola, Vietnam, and Cuba, with basing rights in Iraq. Soviet military advisors, arms, and intelligence agents are stationed in Syria, Libya, Benice, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, the Cape Verde Islands, Sao Tome and Principe, South Yemen, and Peru. Using Cuba as an air and naval base, the Soviet Union has helped install and arm a Marxist regime in Nicaragua and supplied arms to Marxist guerrillas in El Salvador. These strategic positions allow them to strangle trade by cutting off free world access to primary sources of energy and necessary minerals.
Protecting America's international markets and resources demands more than Cold War rhetoric and military spending. New strategies and forces have been designed to stop what the Reagan administration sees as a dangerous drift towards Third World autonomy. Since defeating Vietnam, the Pentagon has developed a strategy of linked military escalation. Public opposition to direct military intervention has resulted in low-intensity warfare, or war without the appearance of war, such as using the Contras in Central America. Mid-intensity warfare means direct US intervention. The first troops in could be rapid deployment forces, especially developed to intervene anywhere in the Third World as a nuclear-equipped substitute for larger conventional forces. In high-intensity warfare, the air-land battle doctrine, the official war fighting doctrine of the US Armed Forces, promotes a strategy where battlefield nuclear weapons may be used in the early stages of conflict to avoid a long Vietnam-style war. As conventional weapons are developed to become more powerful and nuclear weapons more usable, local wars in the Third World now make the threat of a nuclear attack more likely. But the Cold War game can also be played with subtlety.
We could never replace what America does to defend our way of life. But we can make sure that we shoulder a fair share of the burden. And that is why this government has increased defense spending in real terms every year since 1979. And that's why we are willing to act when necessary beyond the NATO area. But we recognize that the challenges we face are not confined to Europe.
The aim of exercise Saif Sariyar, Swift Sword, is to see how quickly Britain can get to the aid of an ally outside the NATO area, putting into effect the lessons learned during the Falklands War.
The United States has essentially two demands of its European allies. One is that they ensure that their own populations remain under control and not move in the direction of independent nationalism, national capitalism, certainly no form of socialism. So keep politics and the economic structure essentially under control. Secondly, they must be available for intervention in the Third World, but in a limited fashion within the framework of U.S. power.
Control of the Third World also relies on regional powers such as South Korea, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. South Africa, for example, is integral to both the world economy and to regional control. As such, it receives strong tacit support in the US. Cartoonist Jules Pfeiffer characterizes the views of the US moral majority this way.
South Africa is part of the free world.
The free world is in a mortal struggle with the communist world, which enslaves its people. If South Africa frees its blacks, they will take over the government. They will join the communist world, which enslaves its people. So, in order to remain part of the free world, South Africa must continue to enslave its blacks.
As God is my witness, Reverend Falwell, you're a great communicator.
And now we've reached a critical juncture. Many in Congress and some in Europe are clamoring for sweeping sanctions against South Africa. The Prime Minister of Great Britain has denounced punitive sanctions as immoral and utterly repugnant. Well, let me tell you why we believe Mrs. Thatcher is right. The primary victims of an economic boycott of South Africa would be the very people we seek to help. Most of the workers who would lose jobs because of sanctions would be black workers.
Well, I want to say very respectfully, I found the speech nauseating. I just think it's a disgrace to have come from the leader of the Western nations, whose country has imposed sanctions in Nicaragua, against Libya, in Poland, and have never once discussed whether those sanctions were going to be effective, and certainly never asked whether they were going to help or hurt those they were trying to help. He, Mrs. Thatcher, and Chancellor Cole should say quite clearly, blacks, you are utterly dispensable.
The US and South Africa share an unofficial policy of destabilizing the socialist governments of Southern Africa, which they both see as a threat to South Africa's role in the world economy. Today, the frontline states suffer from Western-backed low-intensity warfare, from subversion and guerrilla attacks in Angola to the utter devastation of Mozambique. South Africa illegally occupies Namibia, using it as a base for further attacks on Angola. The CIA is active throughout the region.
Foreign policy many times has to result in covert acts or in a presence someplace just because of intelligence information that you have. If you have to ask for permission, what confidence would the world have in you?
The general dissidence of American public opinion made it impossible for the administration to emulate its predecessors, Kennedy and Johnson, for example, and simply to carry out direct aggression, open direct aggression intervention in Central America. They were forced underground. They had to construct an international terrorist network of considerable sophistication with shadowy CIA subsidiaries enlisting proxy states such as Taiwan and South Korea and Saudi Arabia and Israel and so on in support of these objectives.
Illegal White House objectives that were proudly revealed.
I came here to tell you the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm here to tell it all.
When stymied by the democratic process in Congress, the Reagan administration turned to the volatile mixture of covert action and private enterprise that resulted in Irangate. The hearings resulted in Oliver North becoming a national hero.
I saw that idea of using the Ayatollah Khomeini's money to support the Nicaraguan freedom fighters as a good one. I still do. I don't think it was wrong. I think it was a neat idea. I never carried out a single act, not one, Mr. Niels, in which I did not have authority from my superiors.
What Dr. Johnson once called the last refuge of the scoundrel is now the first line of defense. Patriotism.
Well, way down the White House basement lived a Colonel man who figured that he had to help his Uncle Sam. He thought he was a hero who could save the day by making Nicaraguan commies go away. He never ever learned to read the law so well, but he could
During Vietnam, television made many Americans question their government. Today, it helps exorcise the ghosts of Vietnam. TV was the vehicle for Oliver North's performance as yet another misunderstood American hero, trying to turn defeat into victory, wanting only one thing.
For our country to love us as much as we love it.
Every time the U.S. has intervened in Central America, our presidents have pledged that it was on behalf of democracy. But we ended up sponsoring violent right-wing dictatorships. Does that mean intervention is always wrong in Central America? Does that mean we should permit the errors of history to soften our idealism? No, we must keep on intervening until we get it right.
Now, before I go any further, let me say to those who invoke the memory of Vietnam, there is no thought of sending American combat troops to Central America. They are not needed. Thank you, and as I say, they are not needed, and indeed, they have not been requested there. All our neighbors ask of us is assistance in training and arms to protect themselves while they build a better, freer life. We must continue to encourage peace among the nations of Central America.
In El Salvador, the proxy army is a Salvadorian army itself. Using a local army to maintain foreign control has been used throughout history, from the Romans in Britain to the British in India.
Como siempre aquí uno es pobre tiene que hablar sus derechos, ¿va? Y por eso los perseguían. Y nosotros quedamos sin nada, los quemaron todas las cosas, las casas y por eso. Y todo en el valle así fue.
Porque han matado bastantes compañeros, compañeritos. Aquí no se imagina todos los que han muerto, compañeros. ¿Ah? Niños. Compañeras jóvenes descabezadas, mire, después que las han violado, descabezadas. O los niños está colgándolos del cielo aquí así, mire, dándoles de patada a los niños.
¿Cuál es la situación de los trabajadores en El Salvador?
Que tenemos hambre y el sueldo no alcanza para llenar todas las necesidades. Todos tenemos hijos y la carestía de los víveres cada día va más arriba y los sueldos están estancados.
Que los enterraron y el pueblo los vio. Los matan a pura sangre fría y esa cobardía no perdona Dios. Apolinario no ha muerto, ni Patricia Puerta sigue en acción. También Chepe López y Félix García siguen orientando la revolución.
Y la realidad es que si tener hambre es ser político, creo que todo el pueblo salvadoreño será político, ¿va?
The revolution that smolders in so many impoverished countries burst upon El Salvador in 1979. The rebels soon controlled a third of the country. The ruling families and their army turned to the US for more help, which they received. Observers agree that guerrillas like these would have long ago overrun the army were it not for US support, which after 9 years of civil war accounts for 80% of the national budget.
The press played its role quite faithfully in the El Salvador case. When the US organized slaughter began, in 1980, the press pretended that the atrocities were being carried out by uncontrollable right-wing death squads. They knew that that was a lie, and they later conceded that The government had been telling them that 90% of the atrocities were carried out by the Salvadoran government. Throughout, the U.S. press has portrayed President Duarte as a liberal reformist who is under attack by lunatics on the right and on the left. This President Duarte is responsible for more killings than any single person in the bloody history of Latin America. One can attribute at least 40,000 dead to his role.
US support for what some people call authoritarian and what others call repressive regimes is now seen as the key to low-intensity conflict, a method of control by proxy with less risk to direct US involvement. Washington's support for El Salvador is not only financial and diplomatic, it includes military aid and training, intelligence information, and air power.
La P, la F, la L y la Ulu, la C y la H, la peluca.
Massive government bombardment of villages in the guerrilla zones, with everything from bullets to napalm, has kept the civil war in stalemate.
Once the atrocities had essentially succeeded in their goal, press coverage declined, debate reduced to zero. There is complete enthusiasm over this marvelous triumph of democracy, now that any conceivable basis for democracy has been destroyed in one of the major exercises of international terrorism and destruction and slaughter of the modern period.
For example, if American efforts to help El Salvador fail, President Reagan said,
"If we cannot defend ourselves there, we cannot expect to prevail elsewhere. Our credibility would collapse, our alliances would crumble, and the safety of our homeland would be put in jeopardy."
Cocaine? Crime? Children, crisis, cities. Communists. Communists smuggle cocaine to our children who commit crimes, creating a climate of crisis in our cities. Nice one, Ronnie. Nice. What a boy.
Today, Cuba even provides safe passage for drug traffickers who poison our children. In return, of course, Cuba gets hard cash to buy more weapons of war.
Nicaragua. Nicaragua carries cocaine from Cuba to our children who commit crimes, creating a climate of crisis in our cities.
What are you doing, Ronnie?
Communicating, Nancy.
The Somoza family dictatorship had ruled Nicaragua since the 1930s when the US Marines put them in power. In 1979, Anastasio Somoza was overthrown. Under the leadership of the FSLN, the Sandinistas, the country set about solving the perennial problems third world countries face, providing food, health, security, and education.
The program of the FSLN is directed to solve all those problems. And I am convinced about that. I am involved, I love Nicaragua, but it's not only that I love the food here, or it's not only that this is where I was born, so it's my home. It's not that kind of love only. Besides that, I love my people in such a way that I want to be involved directly in solving or trying to solve all the problems that we have. Loving them in such a way that we don't see anymore those little kids with the big bellies full of parasites and barefooted or all dirty and grown-ups and kids that don't know how to read and write.
In Nicaragua, in the immediate post-revolutionary period, there was a rapid increase in health services, in literacy, in subsistence agriculture. There was striking beginnings of economic development. This was registered by the international banks, by the charitable organizations. Oxfam, for example, described Nicaragua as unique among 76 developing countries in the commitment of the political leadership towards economic and social development and the engagement of the population in these reforms. All of that set the alarm bells ringing in Washington, and one can easily understand why. Consider a peasant in Honduras who's starving to death and who can look across the border and see that in a country no better endowed than his own, people are beginning to plant subsistence crops and they're getting health care and they have some hope for the future while he's starving to death and his children are starving to death. He'll ask the question, why not us? And the rot will spread. And it may spread to Guatemala and it may spread beyond. And that's exactly what has concerned American planners.
The specter of Marxist-Leninist controlled governments in Central America with ideological and political loyalties to Cuba and the Soviet Union poses a direct challenge to which we must respond.
When you have the moral authority and your neighbor sees what you're doing, they want a change too. And that's why they're afraid. That's why they say we are a threat. And in a way, probably that's the threat. It's our example. And as many of our leaders have said, we are friends with all the countries. Within our policy of non-aligned, within our policy of having good relations with all the governments.
Today, few people expect Washington's proxy army, the Contras, actually to defeat the Nicaraguan army. Over the last few years, the real goal has proved to be the destruction of the economic and social progress the country has made. In third world countries like Nicaragua, these are the day-to-day effects of the Cold War. Defense takes money for food, books and medicine. Economic blockade means shortages of food, shortages of all necessary goods. Dozens of health clinics closed, hundreds of schools destroyed, 5,000 kidnapped, 43,000 killed, 250,000 displaced people.
We Nicaraguans want is to be independent, to be free, to continue being free, not to be slave as we used to be. To be able to decide our own destiny without interference, without war. And we want to make the hombre nuevo. And that's not being machista, it's the new man. That means the new woman and the new man. The new society.
El amor venció. Queremos pan con dignidad. Queremos pan con dignidad.
The Reagan era has seen the declaration of America's new Cold War. The attempt to control the Third World under the pretext of saving the West from communism. Despite the unrelieved pressure on such countries today, the United States is no closer to stemming the rising tide of Third World self-determination than it was in Vietnam.
Aunque Mr. Reagan nos quiera bloquear, tendremos pan por la solidaridad. Óyeme, en Canadá. Queremos pan con dignidad. Queremos pan.
It is essential for us to mobilize against the danger of nuclear holocaust today, but we must also come to understand and appreciate and concern ourselves with the constant, regular costs of these systems of oppression. Now, that's harder to visualize and to bear in mind than a terminal nuclear exchange, but that is the real meaning of the Cold War.
And the world watching our reactions to the Third World, because the stakes of the Third World War. It's the neutron bomb for Lebanon. It's the gladiator invader of Grenada. It's millions more for El Salvador. He's up to his keisters with the Sandinista. Would we take Fritz without grits? We'd take Fritz the cat. Would we take Jesse Jackson? Hell, we'd take Michael Jackson.
We don't need no rerun. We don't need no rerun, you know. We don't need no rerun. We've seen all the reruns before.
Rerun, the Late Late Show, a black and white flick from ages ago. A rerun, the Late Late Show. Ain't we seen this film somewhere before? It's a rerun, the Late Late Show, a black and white flick from ages ago. A rerun, the Late Late Show. Ain't we seen this film somewhere before?